Hi and welcome to another episode of Inertia Creeps. Today I'm joined by a panel of wisdom, I think I'll call it. Professor Valerie Pierce, who was described by the Irish Times as being a modern philosopher in the marketplace, and Emily Heslop, who is a founder of Culture One and an advocate, activist maybe, for neurodiversity and inclusion in the workplace. You're both very welcome. I'm going to be referring to these wonderful books of Valerie's during our chat, Focus, The Art of Clear Thinking, and Making the No Day a Yesterday, which actually is a fascinating exploration of negative thinking and how we get out of it, which is something that I'm obviously a big fan of and you've heard me talk about many times. So ladies, you're both welcome. Valerie, if I start with you, I've mentioned your books, I've mentioned the Irish Times. You do phenomenal work, and particularly around this concept of critical thinking and clear thinking. Maybe just for the listener, give us as much as you can a short explanation of your career, both professor, author, and all the other work you do.
Okay. Thank you, Niall. It's a pleasure to be here. I started my career by doing a degree in philosophy at Trinity College Dublin. I just absolutely adored philosophy. And in philosophy, we think about how we think. Mm-hmm. So the whole thought process is taken apart to see if it makes any sense, basically. Mm-hmm. So I worked my way through college all the time. I was at Bristol University doing postgrad, working as a receptionist in a management training school. Mm-hmm. People are quite rude in front of receptionists, so they talk away. I heard everything that was going on in the courses, and I thought they're missing philosophy. They've lots of psychology in courses, but no philosophy. So I went to the head of the school and said, I have a course I'm calling Clear and Critical Thinking, and he let me go ahead with it. The professor in Trinity told me to come back to Dublin. He'd help me give me tutorial hours in philosophy in Trinity in order to set up the business. So now I work globally, running training courses on clear and critical thinking, which means looking at thinking skills in business for problem solving, decision making, influencing leadership. Whatever you need to do, you need to look at the thought process you put into it. Mm-hmm. So I've written a few books as well on focus and quick thinking on your feet, which is all about this business of what the French call staircase wit. Mm-hmm. This brilliant ability we all have to know after the meeting what we should have said during the meeting as we're going up the stairs to bed. And that's because our thinking was derailed. Mm-hmm. That goes on a huge amount in business. Mm-hmm. And I know Emily's going to talk about diversity, and what people say about my training is that it helps them to be confident, that no matter who is trying to derail them or tell them they're not good enough for X, Y, and Z, that they're able to think well for themselves. And that to me is what I'm trying to do. Along the way, I became a professor at Ashridge Business School in Britain. So that's me.
That's quite an impressive story, and we're only scratching the surface. But it's really interesting to me, actually, when you talk about philosophy and understanding. That's very much how my brain works. I'm always looking at the how and the why, and the psychology teaches you a certain amount, but like it's fascinating to me how little we understand of the human brain even now. Somebody described it as being like a map of the world that was flat, like we still don't understand. But philosophy is so important in us looking beyond what we know about neural pathways and stuff like that. What I do think is particularly interesting, and it's something that I will go into with you, is so I was diagnosed last year with ADHD, and a whole world of understanding opened up for me about how my brain works and my challenges, and certain things that I would have beaten myself up about over the years that I now understand a little bit better. But one of the things is getting derailed from your train of thought. It can happen, and it's something I spoke about it in a previous episode, where I was talking about the fact that if I was being interviewed for a job, and an informal interview, I'll absolutely be on fire. I've no doubt. I'm totally confident. Informally, I've gone in and blasting people away with what I know. Put me in front of a panel and in a formal interview structure, and my brain gets totally derailed. I start to think about, well, what do they want to hear? and not me showcasing what I know. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to talking to you about. But just on that, Emily, that kind of concept of being derailed or of thinking about things in a slightly different way, this is at the very heart of your company and the work that you're doing. And I mean, you come from, maybe tell us a little bit about your background and you have your corporate background and how you've identified, I suppose, the need for the work you're doing right now.
Yeah, thanks, Niall. Not the easiest to go after with Valerie, is very impressive. But my background is over 15 years HR experience, and I guess for a lot of the work that I was doing, it's around helping to create the people strategies to be able to deliver on the business strategy and business success. And a lot of that, of course, is around talent development, learning and development, succession planning, and a lot of the work that I was doing or involved with as well was within diversity and inclusion, and being involved with the employee resource groups or ERGs and different committees and communities. And that was something I was really, really passionate about. And it was around how do we bring the conversation holistically from the ERGs into making sure that we've got diverse representation across the whole organisation, and through that lens of everything that we do. After a while, I wanted to, and I've been wanting to do it for a little while, is to go out on my own. I did that. I left the corporate world and started Culture One, and I guess a big part of the work that I do, and something that I'm really passionate about, is creating neuro-inclusive workplace cultures, and that comes from personal experience. I'm, a mum to two neurodivergent children as well, so I really want to make sure that by the time they're ready to enter the workforce, they know that there's going to be opportunities open for everybody, and that just because they think differently or they're so intelligent in their own way. So it's around how do we create inclusive workplaces for everybody to thrive, because I think and one thing I'm really passionate about is the more neuro-inclusive we make cultures, the more that benefits every single employee in the organisation.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I might just stay with you for a second. When we talk about inclusion, there's always going to be I suppose traditionalists, but people who say, oh God, like everybody's getting a label these days and everybody's got something. And obviously, my views of it are that I believe we're all different. We all function differently, and some of us are further down scales than others. And, it fascinates me that the idea, like there's an assumption that if you're neurodivergent, that means that you struggle in school. But we also know that the medical industry is very neurodivergent. We know the academic industry is very neurodivergent. So there's a whole scale of kids in school who are extraordinarily good at exams who are neurodivergent. So if we're looking at that kind of, and then there's everything in the middle, and suddenly I start thinking, I think about it like with a philosopher's hat on, about what if every individual in the world was recognized as being diverse and normal, and what if we just had a conversation that allowed them to thrive? So from your perspective with the work you're doing, and you talk about your kids, and I totally get where you're coming from. I have two kids who have had their own struggles, and we won't talk about schooling today because I'll get very angry, but the idea of creating an inclusive workplace for them when they come out that they have opportunities, what does that look like, do you think?
I think for those opportunities, it's not to have that stigma or the barrier that they feel they can only go into one area of employment, or that they can only be good at, in one area,
Yeah, if
the world is their opportunity.
I got asked that recently. Actually, sorry for interrupting you, but I got asked that recently. I was chairing a talk with an expert on neurodiversity, and I was asked the question: is somebody who's neurodivergent better off working in IT? I was thinking we've a long way to go if that's the mindset. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't matter what they want to go into, to know that the door is going to be open for them. Then that's the I guess the passion and the drive behind my work.
Valerie, I struggle to know where to start. Actually, there's so much there. But
well, if I can pick up perhaps on what Emily is saying, because in critical thinking, as I say, my whole being is to be out there and help people just to be who they are. And I'll never forget 20 years ago, a Nigerian girl on an MBA at Ashridge said to me after a 3-day course, "You make me not afraid to be myself." I came back to Dublin. I was working with people from Thailand. This was completely unrelated. This young woman came up to me and said, "You make me not afraid to be myself." So I thought, I didn't even know what I was doing.
That's incredible.
But I thought, at least it's working, if you like, and that's what, when I hear you say everyone should go, no matter who they are, in a direction where they want to go. There should be no barriers. And if our thinking can help us to feel confident to do that, that's the message I was getting from these young women, that they're feeling confident enough to go back, especially to Nigeria, this is in the 1990s, and to be a young woman and not to be afraid to be herself. She didn't have to change, I think, as Emily's saying, to fit in somewhere. She could be herself because she had the confidence to think in a way that made her feel comfortable. And that's, I think, what thinking should do.
Oh, absolutely, and what fabulous feedback to get from work you're doing. But when you work in when you study philosophy, and philosophy is obviously very kind of theoretical and analytical, yeah. How do you, like, the work that you do in your books is very practically minded, and I'm a big fan of practical application of theory. So what is the kind of challenge for you, kind of when you look at something analytically and then you go, well, what does this mean to somebody in helping them live their real life?
Exactly. I had a huge learning curve myself. I remember giving a talk when I just came out of university to a junior chamber group, business people. And nobody understood a word of what I was saying. And they asked the most intelligent person in the room, and they said, "Eamon, can you have," or nobody asked a question. "Eamon, do you have a question for Valerie?" And he just looked up at me and said, "I haven't a clue what she's talking about." So that was wow. I remember my boyfriend at the time, I said, "I'm going to give this up." And he quite sensibly said, "One remark and you're going to give up your whole career." So, and there again, negative thinking. There was a negative situation that made me completely turn around what I was doing, because I knew the background, but obviously not the destination I was trying to get to. So what I've done, and again, I heard Emily say the wonderful word several times, is help people to think clearly in a practical situation. So for example, we like to think we're passionate. I know you said the word several times, and when somebody is passionate, that's marvelous. And people say to me, "I want to be passionate." But what happens, and just like you've said as well, Niall, when I go into a room and I'm a bit scared or I'm lacking in confidence because it's very formal, what happens is I change from passion to emotion. So I've made a distinction now in my training whereby to be very clear about what those two words mean in a situation where you want to be comfortable in your thinking. If you're passionate about what you want to do, your thoughts and feelings are connected to the project. So if somebody criticizes you or frightens you, you listen, because you think, there's something blocking me here. What is it? Somebody's brought up a problem, for example, early on. If I can overcome that problem, I'm nearer to the goal I'm trying to reach. If I can overcome these obstacles, I'm nearer to the project I want to achieve. So I think passion is a form of strategic thinking, because every single thought you have is going towards the goal. If you're emotional, it'll feel like passion. Like lots of people who are emotional will say they're passionate. The big difference in thinking is, instead of thoughts and feelings being connected to the project, they're connected to the ego.
Yes.
So, and I thought of that when you said you're formal and informal. When it's informal, you're totally focused on what you're trying to do. When it was formal, you were slightly focusing on the ego who was trying to do that. Yes. Yeah. So what I'm trying to train people to do is try to just notice, because if you're emotional, you might feel more stress about achieving the project. Oh, so-and-so stopping me, or I'm no good at this, or I can't do that. I just say, try and come back and focus on the issue not the ego. So if you go into a meeting, you go in to have an issue conversation, and I make people draw a little reality bubble. Just look at that reality you want to achieve. Keep focused on the issue. If you feel you're going to an ego conversation, or somebody is forcing you to an ego conversation, come back to the issue.
I love
so that's
that.
trying to
and,
be practical.
And actually, that aligns with. I did some work down in Auckland a number of years ago, and I discovered a lot about, like, obviously I was working in rugby, so I was looking at what New Zealand were doing, and they had a philosophy. They called it response versus reaction.
Absolutely.
And actually, what they even simplified it down to the blue head and the red head. And the blue head was cool and the red head was hot, right? But what it was that your response to a situation was that you were kind of rationally evaluating where you needed to go. Your reaction to a situation was the red head, which was pure passion and flowing into emotion. And what I actually think is really interesting is that Emily and I probably both come from the idea of how do we help organizations to change, to create the environment. Whereas the stuff you're talking about there is probably more directed at the individual having the power to take control of their own situation, which I think is hugely important too. With that in mind, I mean, I do an awful lot of work, have done an awful lot of work in sport especially, where I worked with athletes around understanding the negative voice in their head and the amygdala and all the kind of different reasons that these negative messages get flooded through your brain, and how to manage that. Your book here about making no day yesterday, great title by the way. Tell me a little bit about your I suppose your motivation for it, but also like the how it becomes practical tips for somebody to navigate disappointing situations. Because obviously, as I was saying to you before we came on air, I've written a book, and it's all about sharing stories of people who've had really, really negative experiences on the way to great successes. And I believe it's their ability to navigate those negative experiences is what led to their success. So tell me a little bit about the motivation, I suppose, and how it becomes practical to people.
Okay, probably my belief is that thinking is something that is a fantastic survival kit for all of us. No matter what the thinking is or where it is on any kind of graph or whatever you like to call it, it is a survival skill. So I'm very positive about that. So I looked at negative thinking and I thought, why are people so afraid of negative thinking? Why do they back off negative thinking? And I had a negative experience. If I can it's just a very short story. It's in that little book, and very practical. And because it appeals to business people because they're traveling all the time. And I think in order to think like this, you probably need to be quite determined. Mm-hmm. So what happened to me, I call it the bag story. I was asked to speak at a conference in the south of England. Very quickly, I was to go over one evening to speak in the morning, to come back in the afternoon of that second day. So I put all the clothes, all the papers, everything I needed for the conference into the bag. For some reason, I put that bag into the hold of the airplane. I walked up into the airplane. So I had to go to a conveyor belt in Gatwick to get the bag. Mm-hmm. This was 7:30 in the evening. This was so posh. There was a chauffeur. There was a chauffeur waiting outside, and never is a chauffeur for me. So I was more hysterical because I thought there's a person out there who thinks I'm completely daft because I can't get my bag. So I was at this conveyor belt, no bag. And of course, everyone else, you're invisible, they go off with their bag. So I had to get the bag. I could not do the conference without the bag. So to get the bag, I had to meet the airline woman. So I don't know if you've ever met the airline woman. Very nice lady, but I think she's trained not to give us the bag, because she came over to me and the first thing she was sympathetic. Now I have to explain this because people often think sympathy is wonderful. Sympathy makes you feel wonderful. Yeah. But in thinking terms, sympathy is the arch enemy of action, because sympathy means no. Yeah. If I'm being sympathetic, yes, exactly. If I'm being sympathetic, it means you are not going to get what you want. So I had to tell this lady as nice as I could to stop the sympathy because I really needed the bag. If sympathy doesn't work, people tend to go to realism. This is also a thought process. These are not true. Mm-hmm. The biggest fault in thinking, I believe, is to confuse logic with the truth. So then she went to realism. Oh, terribly sorry, madam, it's not possible. So I said, why isn't it possible? And she said, because the office in Dublin is closed, we've no carrier, meaning no plane, and we have a no same day policy. So that led her logically, very logically, to the conclusion this wasn't possible. And I was almost convinced myself. And then it dawned on me, she was actually telling me how to get the bag. Because now I knew the needs analysis through negative thinking was an office in Dublin, a carrier, and a policy. So if she said you can't get the bag because the office is closed, we no carrier and we have a policy, that means yes, we can get the bag if we get an open office, a carrier, and get rid of the policy. So there's the answer. So the only thing I really heard was the office. So I said, so what you're saying then is if we got an open office, we might get somewhere. And she said, yes. I said, well, could we telephone? We telephoned. What do you think happened?
Office was open?
Somebody answered the phone. Never confuse logic with the truth. I say that over and over again. Logic is a thought process, but it's very persuasive, unfortunately. Very persuasive. But anyway, when it was open, off she went, got it source retagged, put back in the system. Several carriers go from Dublin to London. They put it on a different carrier. When it was in Gatwick, she just thought that was a bit crazy, so she put it into a taxi, and I got it that night at 11 o'clock.
Fantastic.
So I would have forgotten that, except the company said, you must tell that story, because the worst problem we have in the organisation is people believe they cannot do something. They completely convince themselves they cannot do it, so they go to creativity, something else. If they could come back and see why not equals how to, then if you write down all the reasons why you cannot do something, you're looking at your how-to plan.
Brilliant.
And that's how I use negative thinking, and that's how I would hope. Now, I am aware that obviously, emotionally, there are deeper forms of negative thinking. I'm only scratching the surface of an analytical type of negative thinking, which happens a lot in business, I think. People might feel, oh, I can't do something, and maybe their bosses reinforce that. And I wish, for me, the big desire is, no, that's not true. You have the ability to think for yourself and just try this, sit down. And people have told me they've changed jobs, they've done things they thought they couldn't do because they sat down and thought, okay, I have a brain here. I can use my brain to my advantage. That's the key for thinking, I think.
It's brilliant, yeah, and it is interesting because there's that famous line about people who say it can't be done regularly get in the way of people who are already doing it. And Emily, that's kind of where you come from with Culture One, isn't it? Like, and the idea, and I think a good example of that is the way you speak to organizations kind of from a skills-based point of view rather than kind of the traditional thinking. Tell me a little bit about that, and particularly kind of if we think about it from a problem-solving and challenging the preconceived notion kind of point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting what you were saying, Valerie, and it can so quickly become the norm and the culture of an organisation, can't it? So with a lot of the thinking with Culture One as well is around looking towards the future of work and what that means from a skills-based workforce compared to the traditional role-based framework that we have. And, it really enables companies and, their workforce to be much more competitive, much more agile,
And they talk a lot about competencies. You hear the word competencies been thrown out all the time. And that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? It's the idea that, look, if you have specific skills for the job, it doesn't matter who the person is you want somebody who's got the skills to do the job.
Absolutely, yeah. So it supports both, creating a more inclusive workplace culture because it is very skills-based, but it, again, supports everybody within the organisation. So you're looking at, I think we have a huge underutilisation of skills in the workplace at the moment. So by adopting a skills-based workforce, we're able to reduce the underutilisation of skills. We're able to future-proof against skill shortages. And I think, more than that as well, it opens up more opportunities for careers within organisations as well. So you're opening up more pathways for career mobility within organisations. And when you're able to do that, then you're retaining a wealth of company knowledge as well by, somebody can have 3 or 4 careers within one organisation. How fantastic is that? Instead of having to move, to a different employer, and then you're losing that company knowledge as well with that lever.
And it's interesting. I was speaking earlier with a really interesting guy who's doing an awful lot of work around mental health in the construction industry. And the construction industry has a really appalling record around suicide and mental health support. And there are, that's not to say that construction companies are bad, but it's just that the culture and the tradition of a construction industry lends itself to these problems. And then when companies try to address these problems, they tend to address them in a way that is classically, I suppose, modern capitalist society thinking. That is, how do we protect our organization from being sued? So we implement these issues, but we don't want to implement them for the fear of saying, oh, we were wrong in the past. So it's this kind of balancing act of ticking a box and actually introducing something that's going to make a change. When I listen to Valerie, I'm listening to the balancing. I suppose the negative voice in my head is thinking, okay, now I know I'm going into organizations and some of them are ticking a box. They don't actually care about making a change. I'm also thinking about the ability to give the individual who's going for the job that little bit of resilience and perspective, I suppose, when you walk in the door, of how to communicate yourself. And I wish I'd known you like 20 years ago. My career could have been so different. But from your perspective, with the work you're doing, and I know you have a great kind of belief in people managers and how there's an importance in the role of the individual kind of within the organization. But how do you avoid getting discouraged and falling into the negative mindset side of things when you're walking in the door? And you know in your heart at times that some of these organizations are ticking a box rather than actually wanting to make a change. And how do you see a message landing that actually makes a change, if that tracks?
I look forward to those challenges and those cultures to be able to turn them around, because then, they're can often be the most significant impact that you're making. I think that is the real importance of and around that negative thinking as well, the power of storytelling and bringing organisations together as well around if it was a check the box exercise, which it can be, and we are moving away from that, thank goodness. But I guess that's there's a few things going through my mind with that question is, making sure that you are empowering the employees. So it's not just from the top down, it is very much from the bottom up as well. So you're empowering the employees to be agencies of change within their own organisation, because they know what's broken, they know what is going to work for them. And I think that's the real critical importance of co-creating and co-designing any program that you make from a diversity, inclusion and well-being angle, is to go in and really truly listen to the employees, understand what the challenges are, because they're seeing that, they're facing that on a daily basis, whereas leadership don't often see that. They're often quite separated from, even the challenges of meeting overload and everything else, and email overload, which has a huge impact on the productivity and efficiency and the well-being of the employees. So, I think it's that co-designing whatever those initiatives and roadmap is going to be within the organisation, bringing employees along on that journey, empowering them to be the agencies of change. But then it's also really, really important to have leadership buy-in as well. So, share the success stories of different organisations that may have been, had the same thought process as the organisation that you're, supporting at the moment. Because I think that's the absolute power of storytelling and sharing those success stories, but then bringing leaders in from a business sponsor opportunity as well. So it's not just the employees that are leading these committees or anything else. It's around making sure that they're actually learning and growing and developing in these roles as well. So to have the CFO come and be the financial business sponsor for whichever organisation, to make sure that that they are preparing their budget and they're sticking to their budget, and so again it's that learning and development opportunity. But I guess it's quite a nuanced
but it's a really
holistic
good point,
approach.
because once you've got the buy-in, and quite often the problem, like I hear it all the time, the problem in organizations constantly being told the problem is middle management are struggling, middle management are overloaded, middle management, and I tend to kind of have the question, well, how do you identify your leaders in middle management? Because most of the senior leaders seem to be spending all their time doing the middle management's job, so clearly the people you're promoting to middle management shouldn't be in the position, or you need to trust them and let them do it. I'm fascinated by critical thinking. And I'm thinking about it from the point of view, you touched on something there, Emily, about time and people being overwhelmed and overloaded. And I hear this in all the work I do with senior leadership. I'm constantly hearing the phrase, we have no time. We're completely slammed. There's no time, which in itself is a negative message that can be unpacked, right? But I don't know if you work directly with leaders and organizations, but from your perspective, when you look at that kind of critical thinking thing, I know my approach to kind of answering that, but talk to me a little bit about how you would challenge somebody who's saying, oh yeah, we want to do these things, but we haven't got the time.
That is quite frequent on a training course. You hear, well, this is great, but we haven't got the time. And I do meet people on training courses, so I can't go back into the workplace and see if they have the time. But I do say to them, well, you've taken now 3 hours here. How did you manage that today? And therefore we need to give you something that'll help you to manage your time. And one of the people I do talk about is Teresa Amabile, who's emeritus professor at Harvard. And she did a research project on the right environment for good productivity. And one of the pieces was that you need time and resource. So before I even start the course, I say, I need you to look at what the environment has to be like for you to take this back and do something good with it. So they all sit down and say, oh, we need this, that, and the other. And then I show them what Amabile has said. And I said, if you don't have this in your teams, then this training is useless. So that kind of makes them sit up a little and say, okay, well, maybe,
and now they've got to admit in a room
that
they haven't got that environment.
Exactly. And I say, we don't have to talk about the whole organisation here, because sometimes it is the leaders, sometimes it's not the leaders. Yeah. And I'm very strong on that, because they often say to me, is this course for leaders? Or I say it's for everybody who can think. So it's any level.
Everybody's
whatever.
A potential leader.
Exactly.
What is a leader?
Exactly.
A leader isn't a manager. So.
Yeah. So, so I look at that. Even just the other day, we were doing a course on creativity, and I said, unless this is in your environment, you can't go back and be creative.
And what happens when somebody goes, my manager or my senior leader has sent me on this course, so I have to do it. But it's not in my environment.
But actually they do tend to like the course, because most people come to a thinking course frightened, because they think I'm going to be tested. But I make it sure that it's fun, and that they do enjoy being stimulated. So they go back, and sometimes they say my brain hurts as they leave the room or leave the screen, but they say, gosh, I didn't realize it was this easy almost, so.
It's something actually, and I'm going to... I'll talk to you off air about something I'm planning that I absolutely think I'd love to have you involved with, but it's something that I'm a great fan of getting leaders to try and stop and think about, well, who am I as a leader? Because we all have our perceptions, and we do the courses, and we know all the phrases we need to say, and it's like when you go to a company and they tell you, oh, we have a great culture here. And you go, well, can I go and talk to the cleaning woman or something? And they'll go, well, why would you want to do that? And you go, well, if your culture is great, then nobody knows it better than someone like that. it's something where to get somebody to stop and properly evaluate how they are actually as a leader, and understand the impact of their behavior on the people around them. And we often hear talks about building teams and all this kind of stuff. And Emily, you and I do a lot of work in this kind of area, but with the inclusion stuff. But like how often we honestly evaluate how our behavior impacts on the people around us, even in our personal lives. Like it's we tend to, like, I mean, you'll have an argument with your partner and you'll go away thinking they're completely irrational, and then, you know, you go for a walk around the block to calm down, and then if you actually stop and think about their point of view, you go, maybe she had a point, like, you know, but I'm not going to admit that. But with all, like I love the idea of getting senior leaders in a room and get them to stop and think and critically evaluate their time and challenge their negative voices and all that kind of stuff. Have you found in your work that when you do that there's kind of, you know, you always hear this reference to the aha moments, but do you find that people kind of have these kind of revelations, and sometimes maybe emotionally have revelations about, oh my God, I've been doing it wrong all my life, or oh my God, that's what that means? Or
yeah, there is one exercise where I put people into two completely different groups who want completely divergent goals. Opposite goals, in fact. And I say, you have to create an argument to convince the other side. And invariably, they come back and they present the argument, and the other side are furious. And they, where I did this exercise, and the point of the exercise is to think of a creative solution, first of all. Most groups don't think of the creative solution, but these two did, because I was going from room to room. So, and the creative solution would have solved the problem. So I was going from room to room thinking, these people have paid a fortune for me to come over here, and they've actually worked this out brilliantly. And I thought, you know, they're going to be so cross with me when they come back. You know, is that it, kind of thing? So then the real skill in the exercise is that we all think logic is the same, but because every perception is different, the logic has to change according to the perception, otherwise it won't make sense. And all I'll do is annoy you. And there's a great Aristotle quote where he says, the fool will tell me his reasons, the wise man persuades me with my own. So, and what often happens is they come back with this startling logic that they think everybody will see how brilliant this is. The other group come back exactly the same with the startling logic. They're bound to see our side because of the startling logic. Well, when these two groups came back, there was chaos and mayhem, and they could not get through to each other. And even though they had wonderful ideas, they were furious with each other, they were rowing with each other. How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you try and think that I would ever agree to that? And I just thought, my God, I just couldn't believe it. And the head person stood up and said, this is what is wrong with us. We are absolutely brilliant at thinking of wonderful ways of doing something, but we cannot communicate our needs to each other. And that was the most startling of all. Other people have said, oh, now I realise what I've been doing wrong for 20 years or whatever. But that was the most startling thing I saw, that you may have brilliant ideas, but because you assume other people think like you, you cannot get through to them. In fact, you'll annoy them. You'll really, you know, do untold damage because of your inability to see that your logic cannot appeal to them. In fact, they'll feel destroyed by your logic, because most people misunderstand the idea of an argument. Instead of a story, an argument should be telling a story. But what it tends to do is, if I'm winning, you're losing, which is completely wrong. But I think we're educated to think that. So if I have to win here, you have to lose. This is what was going on. And even though everything they said could have really suited the other side, they had to tell it to them in such a way that they lost. And vice versa. So now both parties think they've lost, when in fact they had fantastic reasons to actually come together. But because they used the wrong, you know, the wise man tells me a story through my own logic.
It's fascinating. And what it is it's, I'm very conscious of the fact that our time is flying by, because this is such an interesting conversation. So I'm going to give you both one piece left, one question each. which, how do I narrow it down? There's so much I want to talk about. But all day. And we'll have you guys back for sure, because I'm loving this. But Emily, if you take that story and you think about the work you're doing and the idea that you, and obviously we are aligned, so that there's always a danger, and so social media has become the ultimate echo chamber where we seek out people who think the same as us, and then we satisfy ourselves with the fact that, oh, they're all saying the same thing I'm saying, so I must be right. And to your point, Valerie, it's about being right, and it's about winning, instead of it being about, well, what if there's an actual common ground and what would make sense? And we've become so polarized, and you see it politically especially, like society's become so polarized. It's like you can't have a middle of the road thought anymore. It's got to be that way or that way. But when you're walking in the door of a company and you have your logic and they've got their logic, and clearly, like, in the main, you're kind of going, no, your logic's wrong. But what is your kind of I suppose, and an element of how do you protect your own bloody mental health with this stuff, like when you're walking out of the room, but also on, like, being open to the possibility that somebody might actually have a very similar, or very open to what you're saying, but is just in a polarized position because of the tradition or the culture of the company or whatever. How do you open up the understanding of where they're at and their challenges, whilst you're trying to get them to understand that, in a lot of companies, the traditional way of doing things excludes so many people from the workplace?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, and I give it to you at the last question, like when a big question, you only have a short period of time to answer.
Yeah. And if I can just really quickly jump back into, you just mentioned social media there, and one thing that I'm seeing quite a bit at the moment, which is great that they're shining a light on it, but the toxicity in social media at the moment around young males and the body image and what they think is, that the lifestyle that they need to have of what success looks like for them. And it's so dangerous with what's happening at the moment. And, we were talking about mental health earlier as well, and it's Mental Health Awareness Month as well. So it's great to see there's a lot more conversation and discussion going on, and there's more awareness going on in schools as well, for high schools or secondary schools as well. So I think that's really important. That popped into my mind when you're talking about social media. But I guess how do I approach discussing with a leadership team? And I was actually only talking to somebody the other day who is, very senior within their DEI role, and they were saying, it's almost like we need to come from this FOMO, this fear of we're going to be left behind if we don't do this. And so why don't you change the language around, well, instead of a fear of being left behind, it's around, well, what legacy do you want to leave? How are you going to leave this company and this culture in a much better place than it is today and when you first walked in? So what does that look like? And let's map that out. And what does great look like for you? And then let's, again, bring different stories and different elements in, but also, bring employee feedback back to the leadership team as well. So it's all anonymized and everything else, but, here are the general trends and themes that your employees are experiencing on a daily basis. And these are the challenges that we need to get ahead of if you want to remain competitive, if you want to retain your top talent and attract the best talent and be, the most innovative and creative and productive. If you want the best employees working here, then, what you're doing today isn't going to get you there. So what does that look like? And let's start to map that out.
Yeah. Valerie,
I don't know if I answered that
question. No, you did, and I love it. You've triggered off so many other things that I'd love to go into, but Valerie, just the last word to you, and on that, and just thinking about that story, and from the point of view of the negative thinking, what would be the approach then when you've got two people who are dealing with polar opposed views try and get them to understand where the negative aspect of the opposing person's view is, and try to get them to see the common ground, or to...
One of the things I often say about all of us is the most dangerous thing that can happen when you approach a situation is believing you're right. Because that means you've already made sense. I often say that thinking is just simply the ability to make sense. Yeah. So if you already think you're right, then you've already made sense. And so you stop thinking. Yeah. So that's the first tackle. And the second one is when they face each other and do that to each other, then they begin to realise that actually they have to use a different type of logic. And I'm just so impressed by Emily, what you've just said. You are following Aristotle's quote, where the wise man convinces me with my own logic. And that sounded wonderful for the companies. You're talking to them through their logic of what they want to achieve, and that will make sense to them. And I think that's what we should try and do, understand we're making sense, but to other perceptions. So not to think we're right, and just to keep asking questions, which is the basis of philosophy.
Great leaders ask great questions.
Yeah.
What a great way to finish. I think it's fairly safe to say that in season 2, Valerie and Emily will be joining us again, hopefully. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Valerie and Emily. What a brilliant conversation, and continued happiness and critical thinking.
Thank you, Niall.
Thanks so much, Niall.
Thank you.